time for another manga, though not part of the Grey Stripe series anymore. This time, we're focusing on the famous leader of Blood Clan and, evidently, the path that led him to where he began in the last chapters of The Darkest Hour. But Scourge only appeared sparingly at the end of one book, which at this point was already almost 4 years old. With Scourge long dead and whatever remained of Blood Clan abandoned in the forest, is there any worth in telling this story? Well, that's really up to the reader to decide. Even if it doesn't end up affecting the future of the series, this book could still be fun and shed some light on a last-minute character who became beloved for his immense and dramatic presence despite his lack of spotlight or depth. At the very least, I can give it a chance. Oh, and for the record, this is the page I'm drawing this time. The Rise of Scourge came out on June 24th of 2008, 2 months after Outcast and Warrior's return and the same day as Cats of the Clans, the field guide I covered in the last episode. Unlike the mangas that came before it, this one is a standalone adventure and gets to be about 10 to 20 pages longer as a result. It was still written by Dan Jolie, like the Grey Stripe series, but this time the artist is Bettina M. Kurkowski. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Who only otherwise worked with the Errands for the Seekers series. The bear one, if you aren't familiar. The art style differences between her and James L. Barrie are immediately apparent, but not detracting. And in fact, Kurkowski's sharp style lends well to the harsh main character and the climate he finds himself in. Back on the similarities side, though, this book also features an opening note from an anonymous errant hunter, suspected to be Vicky, where they talk about how little Scourge's past was thought about when he was first introduced. He was the closest thing to pure evil the forest had, which made him a good enemy, and that was all that was needed. But now that they have stopped to consider his backstory, they realized it could be interesting to go back in manga form and track his progression into the cat he would become. This errand also drops briefly that she imagines Scourge starting sort of like Firestar, but taking a much darker path, which could explain why that idea was so prevalent in the fandom for many years. As we'll soon see, it's not exactly that clear-cut. But before we get into that, let's cover the cast notes. In a sharp increase from all of the Grey Stripe mangas, The Rise of Scourge has a speaking cast of 28 cats, even by combining some cats who are likely intended to be different characters, and it has a named cast of 10. The top 5 cats have 83% of the lines, the lowest we've seen in a manga, but Scourge does of course have the vast majority of those with 262 lines, while the next closest, his mother, has only 31. That said, even line spreads don't seem to be all that likely in the graphic novel area, so I don't have any particular qualms with this book. Let's just see how these characters are used, and what information the manga will tell us about the fearsome Blood Clan leader. We open with our protagonist, a little black kitten named Tiny, squishing into the corner of a bed while his brother and sister, Socks and Ruby, play fiercely on the other side. Their mother, Quince, watches as Ruby accidentally kicks Tiny over onto his back while trying to run after Socks. Quince then scolds Socks and Ruby for playing roughly with their brother, and they complain that they don't like playing with him at all because he's too loud and scrawny. Quince doesn't give in, but Tiny is already hurt to know his littermates hate him, which just about defines their relationship for the first part of this book. Tiny is confused about how to play games, and not especially good at making two-like kits like him in the way that Socks and Ruby are, but he would like to get better. On a whim, he asks his mother about the forest he saw outside, which apparently his father explored a couple of times. The cats of the forest, as Quince tells us, are ruthless and desperate, having to fight every day to survive against each other and all sorts of beasts. She calls them a scourge on the name of all good cats. Also, we learn that Quince's mate, Tiny's father, had ginger fur. Moving on, Socks and Ruby get closer and better at playing while Tiny keeps being excluded, even feeling less loved by his mother. The couple of times he does try to join them, he is quickly bullied away. And Quince's scolding never seems to make Socks or Ruby change their minds about their little brother. Eventually, Tiny decides to prove them wrong by exploring the forest. And although he faces some early success, when he returns home, his siblings and mother don't believe him. And Socks and Ruby now berate him even more for being a liar on top of being a wimp. The last straw comes when a two-leg family comes to look at the kits, and they are only immediately taken with Socks and Ruby. Ruby tells Tiny that kits who can't find two-leg families get thrown in the river, and he is terrified, enough that he decides to run away before anyone can get rid of him. Especially after a taunt about his size from a couple of kitty pets, Tiny is determined to live on his own and prove he's strong, first by going back into the forest. However, he immediately runs into a patrol made up of Thistleclaw, Bluefur, and an apprentice, Tigerpaw. Though Bluefur tries to calm them down and let Tiny go as he's just a kid, Thistleclaw is insistent that an intruder is an intruder, and Tigerpaw seems eager to teach him a lesson by fiercely attacking him while Tiny can't fight back. When Bluefur finally makes them back off, Tigerpaw leaves Tiny with a warning that he'll never forget him, and Tiny runs away. With no home to go back to, no welcome in the forest, and no friends near his house, Tiny wanders deeper into the Tulip place and quickly finds that the desperate cats here are even more aggressive than the ones at home, and not just to him. A friendly old cat lets him know that he is a kitty pet, marked by his collar, and Tiny becomes determined to get it off, but isn't able to by himself. Luckily, he happens across a very slow and old dog who happened to drop one of his teeth before being called back to his owner. Tiny uses the dog tooth to try and rip his collar off, but ends up getting the tooth stuck inside his collar instead. The next day, he asks a different group of cats if he can share their food, and instead of answering, they ask where his tooth came from. Tiny, beginning to catch on to what gets someone respected in his world, boasts that he ripped it off after a battle with a fearsome dog who was going after his food. The cats don't seem to believe him immediately, but they let him have some food regardless, perhaps just to be safe. The next day, though, two cats, Brick and Bone, actually come looking for him. They heard a rumor that he fights dogs and want him to take out a big and strong dog on his own, one that has been keeping all other cats away from the food in that area. Seeing as they still don't quite believe him, they give him until Moonhigh to deal with the problem, or he'll have to leave this two-leg place. As terrified as he is, Tiny climbs a building and looks out over the two-leg place where tons of overtly aggressive cats are desperately fighting over the smallest bits of food because of how hungry they are. He feels connected to those cats as they are all scared together, and decides that he's not leaving another home. He will fight for real. As soon as he turns to fight the dog, though, it becomes scared of his big shadow, and all he needs to do is swipe at its tail once for the dog to run away, yipping sadly. At that point, a large group of the two-leg place cats are ecstatic and immediately want to know the name of their hero. But Tiny doesn't want to be defined by his size anymore, and instead chooses the language that Quince used for the forest cats, deciding to be called Scourge. He now has access to all the food, shelter, and help he could want from the many cats who now fear him, but the memory of Tigerpaw biting into him still angers him, and he knows he's not finished. For the moment, though, he is content to be treated like a heroic leader by the two-leg place cats who now give him food and come to him for help with their problems. A confrontation with a trio of cats from the forest is the first to truly give him pause, as they don't fear him or see him as anything other than a runt. But as they laugh at him in front of his underlings, he knows he must stand up to maintain his power, and he claws at the leader's throat, which quickly gets his own cats back on his side and sends the forest cats running. Scourge starts using his power more to place rules on who can and can't take from areas of the two-leg place, and also begins adorning his collar with more of the teeth and claws he gathers. He feels his heart grow colder, and welcomes it, a trend that comes to a head when Socks and Ruby show up again, begging for help finding food and shelter since their housefolk moved away and abandoned them. Scourge, declaring for the first time that his two-leg place cats are called BloodClan, a name we must assume he based on the ThunderClan he heard Thistleclaw mention at their encounter, relishes in his siblings' desperation before letting them eat and sending them on their way, saying they aren't welcome in his territory anymore. Several more moons pass before he finally gets what he had most wanted, as Tigerpaw, now grown into Tigerstar, is led into BloodClan territory and asks Scourge for his help. Scourge decides to delay his revenge for a short while until he and BloodClan are called to the forest. As we all know, they are presented by Tigerstar as a threat to WindClan and ThunderClan, but when he finds an opportunity, and in this book without even mentioning Firestar's speech about Tigerstar's evil deeds, he viciously attacks and kills Tigerstar. He ends with a speech to himself about how, even though his littermates underestimated him, he has proved to be strong and to live for blood, the only answer in this world. He is Scourge, the leader of BloodClan, and he has won. For about 3 days until he dies, but this book doesn't cover that, so never mind, it's fine. Before anything else, it should be immediately apparent that this book recontextualizes the original arc's events substantially. Based on what little we see in The Darkest Hour, it didn't seem as though Scourge knew Firestar or any of the clans before arriving, and it was presented as though Firestar's speech to him was what convinced Scourge to turn on Tigerstar and take the forest for himself. This story of having a lifelong vendetta to pay to Tigerstar and not even caring enough to mention Firestar's speech doesn't contradict the story we knew, but it is certainly a retcon in that nothing implied a connection before. With that said, it does sort of explain one thing: why BloodClan is even called BloodClan. Scourge could only imitate the naming convention if he had heard of the clans before. So even if this book doesn't delve into the specific reasons for him to have chosen the clan part of the BloodClan name and only gave Scourge an experience with the clan name in passing during a traumatic childhood event, it's a better explanation than we had before. Importantly though, the scene between Bluefur, Thistleclaw, Tigerpaw, and Tiny is completely new and in a time period that hasn't been touched before, meaning that if we were ever to visit the time when Bluestar was a warrior for some reason, this scene would have to have played out. But that would be silly, so let's move on. Easily the greatest effect of this book was actually not in the books at all, but on the fandom. In the latter half of 2008, and especially going into 2009, Scourge was suddenly one of the most popular and drawn figures in the fandom. His utterly painful, edgy, dramatic backstory spoke to a lot of fans back then, and he got an awful lot of art, videos, animations, and more. Often with bangs, extra bright colored hair tips, or color variations to make him as evil-looking and exaggerated as possible. Many of these videos and art pieces are dearly beloved pieces of nostalgia or even inspiration for members of the fandom to this day, so this manga's effects aren't to be understated. One thing I do have a small issue with is how Scourge put such an extreme amount of emphasis on his one awful encounter with Tigerpaw as opposed to the dozens of other cats who treated him badly, or his siblings who bullied him needlessly and relentlessly for his whole time as a kitty pet. He doesn't spend nearly as much time even thinking about Socks and Ruby's taunts or Quince's quiet disappointment as he does Tigerpaw's fearsome face. And when his siblings arrive, though he revels in taunting them for a moment, he offers them food without explanation and still thinks about Tigerpaw during the interaction, rather than anything Socks and Ruby ever said. This was definitely done to give more emphasis to the final encounter Scourge would have, but thinking about it on its own, it doesn't make much sense. However, it is a small and forgivable note. This story also has some small hallmarks of the stories I least enjoy in the modern books. Almost everyone around Scourge, with the exception of the one nice old cat who quickly disappeared, is mean for little to no reason. And for the first half of the book, he has little agency in bringing on or fighting back against his bullies. The Tulip Place is suddenly full to the brim with the most aggressive and self-centered cats we've ever seen, entirely devoid of the sweet house cats that were shown in Firestar's childhood, or in the New Prophecy when cats were taken captive by the Two Legs. However, the Rise of Scourge distinguishes itself from the modern stories I take issue with by having Scourge be a distinct and driven character who takes actions to learn from and escape from his circumstances, even though those circumstances were unfair and, in some ways, unbelievable. He goes out to try and prove himself strong and important to his siblings, and when they don't believe that either, he eventually chooses to leave the house entirely and learn from the cruelty of the cats around him, taking on their stances of power and strength, ruling over everything as he tells just the right lies and becomes just passionate enough about bloodshed and leadership to become the de facto ruler of the Two-Leg Place. The world around Scourge did form a portion of who he is, as he learned from his environment to see what was valued, but he was already a cat driven to be recognized and personally strong before he met anyone in the big Two-Leg Place. He already had an interest in the savage strength of the fabled forest cats, because making that strength his was so appealing, and instinctively tried to kill rather than play with toys. This is why it doesn't make sense to say that he and Firestar could have become each other, as their goals were always different. Rusty wanted to explore, learn, and do right by the cats around him at his base level, and Tiny wanted power, strength, and recognition. If they swapped circumstances, I could imagine Tiny becoming a somewhat selfish hero of the clans as a means to get that strength and recognition, but I couldn't imagine him becoming like Firestar. And likewise, I can't imagine Rusty, as he was, yielding to the cruelty or power plays of the big Two-Leg Place, especially not enough to become Scourge. That's something I'm overall grateful for, though. Scourge doesn't need to be Firestar's direct parallel because they already had a strong enough comparison, in that Scourge didn't have the social or religious backbone that Firestar did, and that is what caused him to lose. His purpose since conception was showing us what Firestar's beliefs and relationships have done for him, and Scourge doesn't need to be Firestar for that purpose to work. The Rise of Scourge is an iconic manga, well known in the fandom to this day for the impact it had on the creative world for a long time. The small quibbles I have with it don't prevent it from being a very cool backstory and a very nostalgic part of Warrior's past. It's definitely worth an hour or two of your time, if you're so inclined. It doesn't have any connection to the main series, but it is quite a bit of fun. And having finished with this, it will finally be time to return to the main series when I return for the next episode of our trip through time.